This is Broiler Chicks Motivational Strength for Different Wood Shavings and Degrees of Soiling by me, Valerie Monckton, Nika Van Staveren, and Alexander Harlander. While litter may seem to be a trivial matter to the welfare of chickens, broiler chicks' inability to escape it, as well as litter's impact on the air quality in the barn, means that proper litter management is crucial to bird welfare. Depending on the farm and breed of chicken, these birds will spend around 5 to 7 weeks on this litter, during which time the litter will accrue with excreta, feathers, and waste feed. In many places in the world, this litter will not be changed until the birds go to be slaughtered. However, farmers in some places may opt to reuse this litter for following flocks. Whether or not chickens approve of either of these practices has not been questioned, yet while we know that chickens will avoid ammoniated environments exceeding 10 parts per million, we don't actually know how they feel about the presence of excessive excreta. One might look to the ancestors of modern-day chickens to show us how domestic chickens feel. Indeed, many wild birds sequester excreta away from resting and nesting areas to avoid attracting predators and spreading disease. However, chickens also practice something called social homocoprophagy, which is a fancy way of saying that they consume the excreta of members in their social group, one possible reason being that consuming fecal excretions could be nutritionally beneficial. So maybe a clean environment would not be desirable or ideal. Therefore, to truly answer this question, we must resort to other methods such as preference and motivation tests. Simply put, preference tests determine animals' relative preference by observing how much time they spend with each of their given options. However, preference tests don't tell us how important a resource is or how much better one option is over another. Therefore, by presenting animals with a challenge that they must overcome to access a resource, we can ascribe value to that resource. We can then compare their motivation to access this resource to something we already know is motivating and important, which is food. There are a number of ways to measure an animal's motivation. For instance, we know that if we look at the amount of time spent with or number of visits to a resource, that gives us preference. If we then add a challenge into the equation, we can use how the challenge affects the time spent or number of visits as a proxy for their motivation. However, while these are useful metrics, the gold standard of motivation assessment involves simply seeing the maximum price an animal will pay to access different resources. This method of measurement is called maximum price paid. So, do broiler chicks show a relative preference for different litter management practices, and how much do they value them? The treatments we chose to reflect these practices are shown. Pine shavings are commonly used as bedding, however they contain toxic components that birds might find aversive. Fresh aspen wood shavings do not contain any known chemical irritants though. Soiled pine and spruce wood shavings are reflective of the litter management practices previously discussed, and since some farms use chemical ammonia reductants to reduce ammonia release from litter, we've also included this as a treatment. Finally, we wanted to know how these treatments compare to typical litter management practices of allowing litter to build up in the home compartment. To determine what the bird's preferences are, we raised 40 female Ross 708 broiler chicks in 2 pens for 3 weeks. During this time, we habituated them to all litter treatments over 2 days. This little video is an example of what happened when I put dirty litter down for the first time, and as you can see, the birds are very curious and they're foraging and dust bathing in the litter right away. Other than that, we followed standard housing practices. When the chicks reached 3 weeks old, we moved them into 6 pens. Each pen was divided into 2 compartments, a home compartment containing soiled pine, spruce, and aspen shavings, and a treatment compartment containing one of our 4 litter treatments, or a feed treatment, which involved removing the feed from the home compartment so the birds had to move into treatment to eat. We switched the locations of the home and treatment compartments daily to prevent side bias, and the birds started every trial from the home compartment. We divided these 2 compartments with a barrier that contained 2 one-way doors. To determine the bird's preference for environments, we lifted the doors, which was equivalent to them pushing 0% of their body weight. However, to gauge the value of these different treatments, we weighted the doors to 10, 20, or 30% of the pen's median body weight. We also applied the door weights in a systematically varied order to prevent any effect of age or body weight affecting our results. To collect our data, we recorded the chick's position through overhead video footage once every half an hour. Since the chicks grew so quickly, we weighed them and adjusted the door weights every 3 days at the same time as we scored their feet for foot pad dermatitis. The image on the bottom left is an image of what a typical foot would look like throughout the experiment, as none of our chicks actually had foot pad dermatitis. In collecting all this data, we sought to determine the percentage of time that birds spent in the treatment compartment, the number of times they entered it, and the average maximum percentage of body weight pushed to access the different resources. We analyzed this data with generalized linear mix models to determine how the outcome variables were affected by resource, door weight, and their interaction. So these are our results. Looking at the average maximum door weight pushed to access the treatment compartment, we see that the birds generally pushed the maximum weight to access feed, while they pushed an average about 22% to access the litters. Different letters on the top of the bars indicate significant differences, so we can see here that the birds pushed a significantly higher maximum door weight to access feed compared to the litters. This graph shows the effects of treatment and door weight on the amount of time birds spent in the treatment compartment. First, showing the bird's response to the lifted doors, also referred to as 0% door weight, we can see that the birds spent about half of their time in treatment with lifted doors and that they spent the same amount of time in all the treatments. However, when we look at their response to the weighted doors, we see that they spent more time in the feed treatment and less time on the litters. Breaking that relationship down by resource, we can see that the birds spent more time in the feed treatment than on the litters, and that they spent an equal amount of time on all the litters. Looking at the number of visits to the treatment compartment over a period of 13 hours, we can see that when the doors were lifted, the chicks entered the treatment compartment 5 to 7 times regardless of treatment type. However, once we lowered and weighted the doors, chicks only entered the treatment compartment once or twice. Again, we see the chicks were more motivated to access feed as they entered the feed treatment significantly more often than the litters at door weights of 10 and 20%, and generally entered feed more often than the litters at 30%, with ammonia reductant treated soiled shavings being the exception. So in general, chicks prefer to stay in the home compartment, with feed being the exception. This makes sense because feed is necessary for survival. However, broilers also have disrupted satiety mechanisms and will eat to maximal capacity, so it's possible they were even more motivated to access feed than, say, a layer. We found that the chicks were not willing to pay a price to access litter. This could just be because they didn't see a difference between the home litter and the treatment litters. However, broiler chicks are more limited by physical ability, meaning their weight, than motivation. The birds also responded the same to all the litters. This could simply be that all the litters were equally unrewarding. So what makes litter rewarding to begin with? While some commercial settings provide bedding mainly for moisture absorption, litter also provides material for dust bathing and foraging. Providing substrate to fulfill these behaviors can help reduce the incidence of abnormal negative behaviors, but more importantly to this experiment, birds will work for substrates to dust bathe and forage in. However, studies have shown that wood shavings are not preferred substrates for dust bathing and foraging. Moreover, despite the aversive aspects, like ammonia, present in soiled wood shavings, other studies have found that birds preferred to dust bathe in soiled wood shavings over fresh, one of the possible reasons being that soiled wood shavings have a much smaller grain size compared to fresh. So maybe this experiment would have had a different outcome had we used a different type of bedding. Our experiment did have some limitations. In particular, our experimental setup was more welfare friendly than many farms. Just an example of that was that none of our chicks had foot pad dermatitis. However, preference and motivation tests themselves are also limited by animals' early life experiences. So when we raised the chicks, we put them down on fresh bedding that we then allowed to accrue with excreta over time, and we had to do this in order to get our home litter, but it may have affected the birds' perceptions later on. Preference tests are also limited by the validity of the task. So the task in this case would be pushing a door, and this has been validated by Olson and Keeling with laying hens, and was also used by Jones et al. With broilers. However, again, since broilers are more limited by physical abilities than by motivation, it's possible that asking them to push more weight might not be an ideal way of measuring motivation. Preference tests also prefer to compare variables over environments, and because litter quality impacts the environment around it, this experiment could arguably be more a comparison of environments than variables. Lastly, chickens make decisions as a group, so this experiment could be more reflective of their decisions in a barn setting. However, a lot of preference and motivation tests opt to test individuals to determine individual preferences, so the way that we did this experiment in terms of chickens as a group is a bit of a pro and a con, in my opinion. In summary, this is the first study of its kind that examines broiler chicks' preference for fresh or soiled litter. Broiler chicks did not show a clear preference for any litter management strategies. Therefore, caretakers must make decisions in the best interest of chicks, because chicks aren't going to make those decisions for themselves. And long-term preference tests are needed to investigate the effects on birds' well-being. I'd like to thank everyone who funded and supported this project, as well as the chickens' new caregivers. These are all pictures of the chickens that were used in this experiment, but now in their new homes. that is all.